"At least my son has a real father," Genevieve said, loud enough for all 20 women in my living room to hear, swirling the sparkling cider in her glass like she'd rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. She was looking directly at me, 7 months pregnant, sitting in the guest of honor chair, surrounded by pastel gift bags, and she said it with the easy, practiced cruelty of someone who had been saying versions of the same sentence her entire life and had simply never once been asked to answer for it. My son Theo, 8 years old, sitting cross-legged by the dessert table with a plate of mini quiches, looked up and asked her one question. The room went so quiet I could hear the ceiling fan. My name is Rosalind Hart. I was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant with my second child, when my sister tried to humiliate me in my own living room, and my 8-year-old accidentally exposed a secret she'd been protecting for 3 years. I work as a genetic counselor at a regional medical center, which means my job, most days, involves sitting with families at the exact moment their understanding of their own biology shifts beneath them. Walking someone through what a prenatal screening result actually means, helping a couple decide whether to pursue further testing, explaining gently the difference between a possibility and a certainty. I chose the field after Theo was born, oddly enough, after a pediatrician sat with me for an hour, explaining a minor developmental flag on his newborn screening with more patience and clarity than I'd ever expected from a stranger. And I remember thinking, driving home that night, that I wanted to be able to offer someone else that same steadiness on what might be the hardest day of their year. I'm good at this work because I've learned to deliver difficult information without flinching, and to keep client confidentiality as close and permanent as a second skin, even when the client happens to be my own sister, even when keeping that confidentiality for 3 years meant swallowing every single one of her cruelest comments about my unconventional family, without ever once being able to explain why I never fired back. Theo is from my first marriage to a man named Adam who left when Theo was 2, cleanly enough that I've never had much bitterness left over it. Just the ordinary, manageable grief of raising a child mostly alone through the years that mattered most. Adam sends birthday cards, occasionally calls, lives 3 states away with a life that barely intersects with ours anymore, and Theo has never once, in 8 years, seemed to experience that absence as some deep defining wound, despite what Genevieve's comments always seemed to imply. I remarried 3 years ago to a steady, unremarkable, in the best way man named Julian, who coaches Theo's baseball team on weekends and has never once, in 3 years, made Theo feel like anything less than fully, completely his this baby, the one currently making Genevieve's baby shower comment land considerably harder than it might have, otherwise is ours together. Genevieve has never quite let go of the fact that my real family, as she liked to frame it, took 2 attempts to assemble, while hers on paper looked complete from the very beginning. Genevieve and I grew up 18 months apart, and from as early as I can remember, she was the daughter my mother described first at every gathering, the wedding, the beautiful house, the husband, Marcus, who worked in finance and had, by every visible measure, given her the life our mother had always wanted for at least one of us. I remember my mother's specific phrasing, repeated at nearly every holiday for a decade. Genevieve got it right the first time, delivered with a warmth that always seemed to land somewhere just past my shoulder, aimed at a version of success I hadn't managed to build. I was the daughter who got divorced at 26 and raised a toddler alone while finishing my graduate degree, working night shifts at a diagnostic lab to cover tuition, while Theo slept in a portable crib in the break room, an arrangement my supervisor tolerated out of what I've always assumed was pity as much as kindness. Genevieve never let a family dinner pass without some version of a comparison, delivered with a smile that made the cruelty sound almost accidental. A question about whether I'd found someone serious yet. A comment about how lucky I was that Theo was such an easy kid given everything. I absorbed most of it for years, the way you absorb things from a sibling you've simply decided aren't worth a fight. Right up until the evening, she decided my own baby shower was an appropriate stage for the sharpest version yet. 3 years earlier, Genevieve had come to my clinic quietly, without telling our mother or anyone else in the family, for a prenatal screening during her own pregnancy with her son, Bennett. It wasn't unusual for family members to end up in my office eventually, given how small our regional medical community actually was, and I treated her the exact same way I treated every other client. Full confidentiality, full professionalism, no acknowledgement outside that room that the appointment had ever happened. I remember her sitting in the same chair I used for every patient, visibly uncomfortable at the arrangement, telling me flatly, before I'd even opened her file, "This doesn't leave this room, Rose, sister or not." I told her the truth, which was that it never would, that my license depended on exactly that boundary holding regardless of who sat across from me. I remember at the time one detail in her screening notes that struck me as slightly unusual, a family history inconsistency that raised a question only Genevieve could actually answer, one I noted, discussed with her privately, and then set aside, professionally bound, not to raise it again unless she did. I watched her face carefully when I mentioned it, the particular stillness of someone absorbing information she'd already half suspected, and asked whether she wanted to talk through what it might mean. "No," she said, quickly, too quickly. "I don't need it clarified. I already know what it means. I didn't push. That's not how my job works, and it's never been how I've operated with my sister either, professionally or otherwise." She never brought it up again. I never brought it up again. Not once, not even to myself, until the night of my own baby shower gave me a reason to remember it in an entirely different light. The signs, in hindsight, had been building for months before that shower. Genevieve grew sharper whenever Marcus's name came up at family dinners, deflecting questions about his work, travel with a briskness that felt new. She'd started arriving at family gatherings without him more often than not, always with some reasonable-sounding explanation. A work trip, a headache, a scheduling conflict, until his absences became so routine that our mother stopped asking. I noticed I didn't say anything, the same way I hadn't said anything about the screening flag 3 years earlier, because noticing things about my sister's marriage felt to me like exactly the kind of territory a good sister stays out of. Right up until the night she decided my living room was fair territory for a very different kind of comment. There was a 4th of July gathering about 2 months before the baby shower. When Marcus did attend briefly, staying only for the fireworks before making an excuse about an early morning meeting the next day, I remember watching him and Genevieve interact that evening, something guarded and formal in how they spoke to each other, entirely unlike the easy teasing dynamic I remembered from their wedding 6 years earlier. I mentioned it to Julian on the drive home, almost in passing, and he said only, "Marriages go through phases," which felt true enough at the time that I let the observation drop entirely, the same way I'd let so many other small observations about my sister's life drop over the years. The shower itself had been going warmly enough until that moment. 20 women from both sides of the family crowded into my living room. A table of pastel cupcakes. Julian had spent an entire evening frosting, despite having zero natural talent for it, a game involving guessing baby food flavors that had everyone laughing more than the concept probably deserved. My mother sat near the center of the room, glowing in the particular way grandmothers do at these events, and even Genevieve's absence of Marcus hadn't yet cast any real shadow over the afternoon. Genevieve arrived late without Marcus, mentioning something about his schedule before anyone asked, and settled into a chair near the gift table with the particular restlessness of someone working up, to saying something she'd been holding on to all week. I noticed it. The way you notice weather changing before it actually starts to rain, but told myself, the way I'd told myself 100 times before, that whatever mood she'd brought with her would likely pass without incident. It came during the gift opening, after I'd unwrapped a soft yellow blanket from my mother, and someone asked whether Julian was hoping for a boy or a girl this time. "He'll love either," I said. "He's just excited to be a dad again." Genevieve made a small sound, something between a laugh and a scoff, and said, loud enough for the whole room, "At least my son has a real father." swirling her sparkling cider like she'd rehearsed the gesture, her eyes finding mine with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opening. The room went quiet in the particular uncomfortable way. Rooms go quiet when someone has clearly crossed a line. Everyone else can feel, but no one's sure how to address. My mother's face tightened. Julian, standing near the kitchen doorway, went very still, and then Theo, 8 years old, sitting cross-legged by the dessert table with a plate of mini quiches, looked up from his food and asked, in the flat, unfiltered way only children manage, "Isn't that why Uncle Marcus doesn't come to things anymore? Because Bennett looks like the guy from Aunt Jen's office and not like him?" Nobody moved. Genevieve's face went through several expressions in under 3 seconds. Confusion, then something close to panic, then a brittle, overcorrected laugh meant to smooth over what had just happened. "Theo, sweetie, that's not. Where would you even hear something like that?" she said, glancing around the room as though searching for an ally. Theo shrugged, entirely unbothered, already reaching for another quiche. "Bennett told me at his birthday party. He said his mom's friend from work picks him up sometimes, and Uncle Marcus gets mad about it." Several of the women exchanged quick, uncertain glances, the particular social calculation of guests, trying to decide whether to pretend they hadn't heard something or to quietly file it away for later conversation. My mother's face had gone through its own transformation, embarrassment giving way to something more searching, as though she were already, in that instant, reconsidering a decade of assumptions about which daughter's life had actually been the more stable one. Genevieve recovered quickly, forcing a laugh and changing the subject to the next gift, but the room's earlier warmth never fully returned for the remainder of the afternoon. I sat very still in the guest of honor chair, hands resting on my own pregnant belly, and felt something shift into place with the particular cold clarity of a professional recognizing a pattern she'd been deliberately not examining for 3 years. I didn't say anything to Genevieve that night. I redirected the room as gracefully as I could manage, thanked everyone for coming, and spent the rest of the shower with a composed smile and a mind that had entirely left the building. Julian found me alone in the kitchen afterward, drying dishes with more focus than the task required, and asked quietly whether I was okay. "I think I need a few days before I know how to answer that," I told him, which was as honest as I could manage in the moment. He didn't push, just took the dish towel gently from my hands and finished the rest of the dishes himself, letting me sit at the counter with a cup of tea I didn't really want, simply being present in the specific, undemanding way he's always been best at. My mother lingered after the other guests left, helping fold wrapping paper into a recycling bag, and paused at one point to ask, carefully, whether I wanted to talk about what Theo had said. "Not yet," I told her honestly. "I need to think it through myself first." She nodded, understanding, and hugged me a little longer than usual before she left, a small gesture that told me she'd understood more of the moment's weight than she was letting on. It wasn't until 2 days later, sitting alone in my clinic office after hours, the building mostly empty around me, that I let myself actually think through what Theo's question had accidentally confirmed, and what it meant about the flag I'd noted in Genevieve's screening panel 3 years earlier and never mentioned again. I sat at my desk for nearly an hour before I let myself pull up the case, my hand hovering over the keyboard, the way it never does for any other patient's file. Because this one, for the first time in my career, felt like it might cost me something personal, no matter which way I decided to handle it. The first thing I did was simply sit with the memory itself, carefully, without touching any record or file. The conversation in that clinic room 3 years earlier, replaying clearly enough on its own, that I didn't need to verify anything against paperwork. I remembered exactly what I'd noted, exactly what I'd said to her, exactly how quickly she'd declined to pursue it further. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't misremembered it either. 3 years ago, my sister had learned something about her son's paternity in a private conversation with me, and had apparently spent 3 years building an entire persona around a marriage, that comment after comment, dinner after dinner, she'd used as a weapon against my own unconventional family. I made a deliberate decision that same evening not to go anywhere near her actual chart, not because I doubted my own memory, but because I understood immediately that even looking would blur a line. I had no intention of crossing memory or not. The second thing came from Julian, unexpectedly, 2 days after the shower. He mentioned, almost offhand, over dinner, that Marcus had called him directly that week. The two of them had always been friendlier than Genevieve, and I ever managed to be, occasionally grabbing a beer together at family gatherings, while Genevieve and I circled each other more warily, and told him, in confidence, that he and Genevieve had actually been separated for 4 months, quietly, living in the same house for appearances but sleeping in different rooms, with Marcus already consulting a divorce attorney about custody arrangements for Bennett. Julian described the call carefully, clearly still processing it himself, mentioning that Marcus had sounded exhausted more than angry, a man who'd apparently spent 2 years quietly carrying something heavy while trying to protect his son from the fallout of finally putting it down. He said he found out about the affair almost 2 years ago, Julian told me, setting down his fork, watching my face carefully, but stayed for a long time trying to make it work for Bennett's sake. 2 years. My sister had known I knew something in some vague, unacknowledged way, and had spent that entire stretch performing a marriage that both people inside it already understood was over. The third thing I learned from my mother herself, 3 days later, entirely without meaning to pry. She mentioned, over the phone, how proud she was of Genevieve for holding that family together through Marcus's difficult year, a phrase clearly supplied by Genevieve herself, reframing whatever cover story she'd been telling our mother into something that painted her as the stable, patient wife rather than the woman who had spent years attacking my family's legitimacy, while quietly protecting a much larger secret about her own. My mother went on, unprompted, praising Genevieve's patience and grace through what she believed was simply a rough professional patch for Marcus, entirely unaware that the man in question had already retained an attorney and moved his own belongings into the guest bedroom. 4 months earlier, I sat with the phone against my ear, saying very little, doing the same quiet math I imagine most people do in moments like that, counting up every comment, every comparison, every small cruelty delivered at a family dinner by a woman who had been carrying a secret this size the entire time. My mother hosted a family dinner 2 weeks later, the kind of gathering that had become routine over the years, and Genevieve arrived, once again without Marcus, offering the same worn explanation about his schedule. The table was set the way it always was, for these dinners my mother's good china, a roast she'd spent all afternoon on, the particular warm chaos of a family that mostly still liked each other despite everything. Genevieve found her way, within the first 20 minutes, back to her familiar territory, commenting on how some families just take more work to hold together than others. Her eyes flicking toward me with the same practiced precision from the baby shower. I had thought carefully, in the 2 weeks since Theo's question, about exactly what I was and wasn't professionally permitted to say, rehearsing the conversation in my head more times than I probably needed to. I called a former colleague, Priya, who'd since moved into hospital ethics consulting, and ran the scenario past her in hypothetical terms, careful not to name names, just to confirm my own instincts about where the professional line actually sat. She confirmed what I already suspected. I could never disclose specific information from Genevieve's confidential screening results. Not to my mother, not to anyone, not even to save my own reputation from her comments. You can always ask questions about someone's current present-day life, Priya told me. That's just being a sister who's paying attention. What you can't do is use anything from inside that clinic room, even implicitly. Keep the two things completely separate, and you'll be fine. Her clarity helped more than I expected it to, giving me a clean line to hold on to rather than the murky, anxious calculations I'd been running in my own head for 2 weeks straight. But I'd decided, ask a single question. Not a revelation, not an accusation, simply a question. The same careful, professional instinct I used every day at work to let a patient arrive at their own truth, rather than having it delivered to them by someone else. It felt in that moment like the only version of honesty I could offer that didn't cross a line I'd spent my entire career protecting. "Genevieve," I said calmly, setting down my fork, "how is Marcus's custody attorney treating the separation conversations? I heard from Julian it's been 4 months now." The table went silent, in the exact way my living room had gone silent 2 weeks earlier, except this time everyone at that table was old enough to understand immediately what the silence meant. My father, usually quiet at these dinners, set down his water glass with a small, deliberate click. "You told me Marcus was working late," my mother said slowly, looking at Genevieve with an expression that had already started shifting from confusion toward something harder. Genevieve didn't answer, her eyes fixed somewhere on the tablecloth. "Genevieve," my father said, his voice quiet but firm in a way I rarely heard from him, "answer your sister." Genevieve's face drained of color. "That's not. Where did you hear that?" "Julian," I said simply. "Marcus told him directly." "I wasn't trying to bring it up here, Genevieve. But you've spent 2 weeks letting Mom believe you're the one holding a marriage together, when Marcus has been consulting a lawyer for months about custody of Bennett." My mother set down her own fork, looking between the two of us, with an expression of dawning, unhappy understanding. "Genevieve, is this true?" Genevieve didn't answer right away, her composure fully cracked now, the same composure she'd weaponized against me at every family gathering for years, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's complicated," she finally said. "Marcus and I have been working through some things." "Working through some things doesn't usually involve a custody attorney in separate bedrooms," I said, my voice still even, still calm, because I had learned, professionally and personally, that the steadiest voice in the room usually lands harder than the loudest one. "I'm not asking you to explain anything else here tonight. I just think it's worth remembering, the next time you decide my family isn't real enough, that yours hasn't been what you've been telling everyone for a while now either." Genevieve stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and left the table without another word, the front door closing behind her hard enough that the windows rattled slightly. My mother sat very still for a long moment, staring at her own plate before finally saying quietly, to no one in particular, "I had no idea. She told me everything was fine just last week." Julian reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a small, steadying gesture that meant more than anything he could have said out loud in that moment. My father cleared his throat and, in the careful, understated way he handled most family tension, suggested we all have some dessert, an offer that somehow managed to feel both entirely inadequate and exactly right for the moment, breaking the tension just enough for the rest of the evening to limp forward without further incident. I caught my mother's eye across the table once more before we left that night, and she gave me a small, tired nod that I understood, even then, as the beginning of something shifting permanently between us. The divorce finalized 6 months later, faster than either of them had apparently expected. Once Marcus's attorney moved forward with the custody filing, he'd already been quietly preparing. Genevieve lost the narrative she'd spent years curating, far more than she lost anything material. Our mother, who had spent a decade holding Genevieve up as the daughter who'd gotten it right, spent the months after that dinner reckoning openly with how much of that story had been performance rather than truth. She called me twice that first month, working through her own confusion out loud, asking questions. I mostly answered honestly, careful still to never once cross into the specific clinical details that remained, and would always remain, none of her business. Marcus was awarded primary custody of Bennett, a detail that surprised no one who understood the timeline, the family court apparently unmoved by Genevieve's attempts to characterize the separation as recent and amicable. Once Marcus's attorney produced 2 years of documented communication establishing otherwise, Genevieve moved into a smaller apartment across town, her sparkling cider composure from my baby shower nowhere in evidence at any family gathering since. She stopped attending most of them entirely for a stretch of nearly 4 months, sending polite, distant regrets that everyone understood for exactly what they were: when she finally returned, at a smaller gathering for our father's birthday the following spring. She was quieter than I'd ever known her to be, sitting near the edge of the room rather than at its center, and I found myself unexpectedly feeling something closer to sadness than vindication. Watching her navigate a version of our family, she could no longer perform her way through. We spoke privately, briefly. Near the end of that evening, the first real conversation we'd had since the dinner that ended her marriage's cover story. "I owe you an apology," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, for a lot longer than just the shower. I told her I appreciated hearing that, and meant it, though I also told her, honestly, that I wasn't sure yet how much of our relationship I wanted to rebuild, or how quickly. She nodded, accepting that without argument, which felt, in its own small way, like the first genuinely honest exchange we'd had in years. Marcus, for his part, reached out to me once. A short, careful email thanking me for not making things harder than they already were, which struck me as an odd thing to be thanked for, given how little I'd actually said. I wrote back simply that I hoped he and Bennett found steady ground, and left it at that. I never asked him directly what he'd known and when, and he never offered more than what Julian had already relayed. Some information, I've decided, is better left where it actually belongs, between the two people whose marriage it was. He sent a photo the following spring, unprompted, of Bennett at a school science fair, grinning beside a baking soda volcano, with a short note that simply read, "He's doing okay, thought you'd want to know." I found myself unexpectedly moved by that small, unnecessary kindness, a reminder that even the most painful family unravelings still leave room for the occasional decent gesture between people who never asked to be tangled up in each other's private business in the first place. I never told anyone, including my mother, the specific clinical details from Genevieve's screening 3 years earlier, and I never will. That information was never mine to share, and Theo's accidental question, however devastating its timing, only confirmed something that was already true in Genevieve's own marriage, not something I revealed on her behalf. What I did share, that dinner and afterward, was simply the truth about her present-day circumstances, which she had chosen, repeatedly, to hide behind a story that made my family look smaller, so hers could look larger by comparison. I've thought a great deal about that distinction since. The line between protecting confidential information and allowing someone to weaponize a false public narrative against you. And I still believe I landed on the right side of it, even on the nights I've second-guessed the timing. My mother and I grew closer in the months that followed, in a way that quietly surprised both of us. She called more often, asked genuine questions about Julian and the baby rather than comparisons, and told me once, over coffee at the small cafe near her house, that she was sorry it had taken her this long, to notice how differently she'd treated her 2 daughters' very different paths to the same ordinary, imperfect kind of happiness. "I think I confused a good story for a good life," she said, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "Genevieve always gave me a better story to tell at church. I never thought about what it might have cost you, watching me tell it. I told her I understood, and mostly I did, though it took me longer than I expected to fully let go of some of the smaller resentments that had accumulated over the years." She started asking, unprompted, to babysit on weekends, once the baby arrived, small gestures that added up, over months, into something that finally felt like the relationship I'd wanted with her all along, rather than the one I'd simply learned to accept. I still think about Theo's question sometimes. The flat, unguarded honesty only an 8-year-old could have delivered, without any sense of what he was actually setting in motion. I sat him down a few weeks after the dinner, once the dust had settled somewhat, and asked him gently why he'd said what he did that day. He looked at me with the particular seriousness kids reserve for questions they take completely at face value. "Bennett told me at his party. And it seemed like something you'd want to know, since you always tell me not to keep secrets that could hurt someone," he said. I laughed, despite everything, because he wasn't wrong, and I'd apparently taught him that lesson more thoroughly than I realized. I've never explained to him the full weight of what he said that day, only thanked him quietly, Later, for being kind to his cousin at that birthday party, for noticing something, and mentioning it simply because it seemed true, without any of the calculation. Adults spend years learning to attach to the things we choose to say out loud. My daughter was born 6 weeks after that family dinner, healthy, loud, entirely unbothered by the drama that had briefly consumed her parents' extended family in the weeks before her arrival. Julian held her the first night in the hospital and told me quietly that he was grateful. Theo had happened to be sitting exactly where he was sitting at that shower, close enough to hear a comment neither of us had wanted our children exposed to, and honest enough to say something about it. I've thought about that framing more than once since, how an 8-year-old's unguarded honesty ended up protecting our family more effectively than any careful adult diplomacy might have. If you've ever had someone build their sense of superiority on a story about your family that wasn't even true, I hope you remember this. The truth has its own timing, and it rarely needs your help to eventually surface. Sometimes it just needs you to stay quiet, stay steady, and let the story someone else has been performing finally run out of road on its own. I think, often, about the particular irony of my own profession, sitting so close to what eventually unfolded in my family, that I spend my working life helping strangers absorb difficult truths about their own biology with compassion and care, while for 3 years I sat on a piece of information about my own sister's life that I was professionally forbidden to acknowledge, watching her use a false version of her own stability as a weapon against me at nearly every family gathering in between. I don't regret keeping that confidence. I think, if anything, it taught me something about the specific, quiet discipline required to hold information you're not permitted to use, even when using it would have been so easy, even when the person withholding the truth from everyone else was the same person attacking you for a family she considered less legitimate than her own. I think, too, about how close the whole truth came to staying buried indefinitely, if Bennett hadn't mentioned something to Theo at a birthday party. If Theo hadn't happened to repeat it at exactly the wrong moment for Genevieve, if any of the small uncontrollable details of that afternoon had landed differently. I don't think Theo's question changed the actual facts of my sister's marriage. Marcus had already known for 2 years, already been quietly preparing to leave. I think it simply accelerated a reckoning that was always coming, and gave my mother, finally, a reason to see clearly what she'd spent a decade choosing not to examine too closely. My daughter is nearly a year old now, and Theo dotes on her in the specific slightly bossy way older siblings do, teaching her words she's nowhere near ready to say, and taking enormous visible pride whenever she manages one anyway. I think about the two of them often, when I think about what a real family actually means. A phrase Genevieve once wielded like a weapon, and that I've since decided has almost nothing to do with how a family started, and everything to do with how steadily its people show up for each other once it exists. Julian still coaches Theo's baseball team every spring, still frosts cupcakes with more enthusiasm than skills, still calls Theo his boy without a hint of qualification. And I've stopped, finally, waiting for anyone else's approval of what that makes us. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever built themselves up by tearing your family down, only for the truth to catch up with them eventually? Leave a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if an unexpected moment ever revealed a truth you'd been quietly protecting, I'd genuinely love to hear that story too. We share stories like this one every day, stories about quiet dignity, unexpected truths, and the moment someone finally stops needing to defend a family that was never the one being questioned in the first place. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.